Good afternoon, everyone. Honorable Professor Liu Xun, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. I am Jiyeon Kim, an Associate Professor of Department of Religious Studies at Seoul National University. Thank you all for joining us today. On behalf of the Institute of Asian Studies at Seoul National University, I would like to extend my warmest welcome to the Professor Liu of the Department of History at Rutgers University. And I would like to thank our director, Professor Kim Byung-jun of Seoul National University, for joining us today. Our speaker, Professor Liu Xun, is a renowned scholar in Daoist studies and the religious history of the late Imperial China and early modern China. Professor Liu was born in mainland China, and he has studied American literature in California State University since 1985 to 1990, and broadened his major into East Asian history since 1991, and gained his PhD in University of Southern California. He joined in Rutgers University as a faculty member since 2003. Professor Liu is the author of very attractive and insightful historiography of modern Daoist Ning, titled Daoist Modern, Innovation, Lay Practice, and the Community of Inner Alchemy in Republican Shanghai. It is published by Harvard University Asia Center in 2009. He is also a co-editor of many important books in the history of Daoism, such as Daoism in 20th Century China, Between Eternity and Modernity, published by University of California Press in 2012. The title of today's lecture is Daoism and Modernity, the Case of Daoist Yao Aiyun and Monastic Activism in Education and Other Reforms in Late Qing Nanyang. Yeah. I hope this special lecture will give us a new knowledge on the local history of Daoist activism in education in the period of transition from pre-modern to modern. I also hope it gives many insight to students and scholars at Seoul National University, and we can foster further academic exchanges between Rutgers University and SNU. Again, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the Professor Liu for sharing his eminent knowledge and experience from his fieldwork and historical studies on this occasion. Please welcome Professor Liu.
Thank you, Professor Kim Ji-hyun and Professor Kim Byung-jun for joining us today, and actually for inviting me to Seoul National University and offering me this opportunity to share actually the findings of my research. And so this afternoon, I also thank the audience as well. On such a beautiful day, you choose to come in this room, closeted air-conditioned room, to listen to this talk. So I'm very grateful. I hope to hear more from you in terms of comments, criticism, and suggestions as well. As Professor Kim pointed out, this talk is really my attempt to understand the relationship between Daoism as a religion and to actually modernity. In other words, how Daoism encountered modernity and how it actually dealt with modernity. I think that I want to begin with my talk with this a painting of our hero. This is Abbot Yao Aiyun, and who's actually his Huashan Pai, Longmen Pai name is Xiang Rui. In this painting, of course, he was depicted as someone who was, sitting at a small garden overlooking a brook, a stream. And next to him is actually a stone table. On the table, you can see actually a half-sheathed Chinese guqin or zither. And right next to him is his page, a young boy who was actually, attending to him. He had a volume of book in his hand. So the picture clearly was done by one of his fans who want to invoke an image of a Daoist who is detached and separated from the so-called the dust of the world. In other words, he's not engaged in the daily sort of toils and sweats of a commoner society. Someone, however, far detached, you might say transcendent from the secular world. So I actually, indeed, in some way, commit the same sin that I'm about to criticize, okay? Using a beautiful painting of this abbot. But I think I want to make a point, because what he did in real life is a study in contrast to what he's being portrayed here. So with that, let me begin. I think that with the onset of modernity, especially with the downfall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, people in China began to look their past legacies such as, of course, religious traditions, one of which is Daoism. I think that I summarize, of course, three very typical kind of sort of perspectives when Chinese people, ordinary people, even sometimes our scholarly colleagues would hold these type of views. One of them is what I call it the popular view. The Daoism is actually seen as the product of an old and outmoded and indeed overthrown society, a toppled society, in which, of course, imperial system dominated. So along with that, of course, usually Daoism is seen as a particular religious system that is somewhat outdated and out of touch with the rhythm of times, with the progress of times. Lu Xun, for instance, very famously said, this is, of course, an iconolistic cultural critic of China, and in his lifetime he wrote about Daoism seldom, but however, whenever he does it in a way that sometimes leaves people bewildering as to what he meant. But if you put his comments, such as Daoism, really the cultural roots of China is found in Daoism. With such comments, it's very vague. But if you put it in the context of what he wrote about old society and all that, and there were occasions he did mention Daoism as not being in coherence with modernity. So here I singled out him as a representative voice, critical of Daoism as a religious tradition that is out of date with modernity, with modern China. As such, typically people would see it as somewhat resistant and even defiant sort of modernity in that sense, defiant of modernity. So this is one typical kind of view. Daoism is backward and it's resistant to modernity. Another typical kind of view, maybe have a long history as well, represented, of course, by a lot of scholars, I think until maybe just 20, 30 years ago, who still held the view that Daoism has been in decline, right? I think to a large extent, there were a lot of truth to that kind of understanding or perception of Daoism, because ever since the post-Song era, we seldom see Daoism in its earlier sort of messianic movement making waves, in Chinese history. Rather, it seemed to have already disappeared, its influence declined, maybe with the exception of the late Ming period, when you have some Daoists still appointed the high post in, of course, at the Ming court. Daoism is pretty much a religion in decline. So that view, in many ways, would indeed blame, of course, Confucianism and others for the decline of Daoism. All right. There is some truth to that. But I wondered, however, even if we do admit that Daoism did sort of leave the center of decision-making and political power, what happened to it? Did it go into local society? Or did it simply disappear? I mean, obviously, it's not disappeared. So we want to know more about how it existed in local society in the sort of a lower stratum of Chinese society. So with this view, let me move to the third. This is my own sort of a sin at the beginning of the talk, showing you a portrait of Yao Aiyun as someone who seemed to be rather detached from the secular world. And so this is the third view, rather stereotypical, that views Daoism as somewhat having nothing to do with this world, but rather it's about the immortals and about, of course, transcendence. Okay, but recent studies, including my own, and many, of course, who are here, including Professor Kim, who work on actually Daoist influence and Daoist development in Korea, would argue that these three type of views probably does not quite capture the reality of what Daoism, how Daoism existed and what Daoism was in the late imperial period of China or East Asia for that matter. So here I, of course, began to, indeed, as I encounter new material in the field work, in the archives, I began to suspect that we might have something very different. Indeed, of course, in the past 20 years, we now see more and more scholarly works by Professor Gosar, by even, or we have Professor Daniel Burton Rowe sitting here as well, that produces work that shows a very different picture from those three views that we were talking about early on. So that's why I got involved in this project. And so and these actually new evidences and new studies led us to ask at least these following questions, right? So if we were talking about Daoism as being victimized or in decline since the Song, what really was its condition in the late imperial period after it being sort of cast out of the sort of a center of power and decision making? That's one question we could ask. Another question we could ask is that if we describe Daoism as a victim of modernization with all the devastation during the Taiping War, and of course during the modern period when religion was suppressed by not only of course the Republican state and later on by, of course, the communist state in China, and does that picture captures the whole reality of Daoism? So here's another question we could ask. If not, then how did Daoism exist? How did it fare during this sort of a very important transformative period of modern Chinese history? So I ask these questions, right? So now, in terms of the sources or primary sources for this study, I try to use and try to actually indeed unearth and develop evidences from actually previously underused or seldom used primary sources. And indeed, of course, in the place where I work, Nanyang, we managed to uncover many new sort of temple steles, which allowed us to look at, of course, this period of history from very different perspective. It showed indeed a very active sort of presence of Daoism. So it is based on this a combination of sort of new materials and or seldom looked at materials, and then of course bring in to bear on this material a social and historical approach that places Daoism in the context of historical changes, in the historical transformations during this period. That begin with, of course, the Taiping War, and then, of course, ended with late Qing reforms and so on. So this is how I approach this particular topic as well. I hope that with this case study of Yao's activism, we can actually indeed bring more nuance and perhaps even a correction to the three sort of very typical kind of views that we used to hold about Daoism. And so let me begin. The story I want to tell today actually begin in a place called Nanyang. Nanyang is a prefectural seat And many of us who study Chinese history knows the administrative system. A prefectural seat like Nanyang actually oversees several, maybe sometimes as many as dozens, sometimes as few as 3 or 4 counties below it. But the prefecture of Nanyang did indeed oversee at least 9 to 11 counties and sub-prefectures. And it is located in actually southwestern part of the central Chinese province of Henan. So this is, when we orient ourselves, this is what we call the Zhongyuan or Central Plain or North China Plain. It is in the southwestern part of it, at the upper stretch of a very important estuary of the Yangtze River, the Han River. You have Hanjiang here. We have also Han River in actually this province of Henan and Hubei. So on this map, I picked out maybe Kaifeng. Many of you who study middle period Chinese history would know Kaifeng. So in relation to Kaifeng, it is southwest. And then further down, many of you may have heard Wudangshan. So this is southwest of Nanyang, is the Daoist sacred mountain of Wudangshan. I point this out because this is not part of my talk. I want to just make a sort of passing reference to this, that during the Ming, Wudangshan is, of course, the epic center of the cult of Zhengwu, another very important Daoist deity, and it's an imperial, nationwide sort of a religion that is devoted, of course, to the worship, of course, Zhengwu, and indeed patronized by the Ming court. And Nanyang played a very important role in this network of major centers or temples devoted to the cult of Zhengwu as well. But that's not our talk today. But I want to, by showing the map, showing the centrality of Nanyang in the traditional religious sort of a world since the Ming and during the Qing. It's declined somewhat, but still important. Now we close up, if we have this close-up view of Nanyang, this includes, of course, the Nanyang suburb and Nanyang city itself. My illustration of these major temples in Nanyang focus primarily, of course, on the monastery of the dark mystery, and Xuemiaoguan, which is overseen by Abbot Yao during his tenure in Nanyang from roughly 1884 to about his death in 1912, early 1912. So you can see this is a place, all these temples actually are part of the Quanzhen Daoism that traces roots to the actually Jurchen Jing dynasty in China, roughly about maybe early to middle 12th century. And here's another close-up look at the place, the exact location of the Xuemiaoguan. And this is, of course, speaking of Nanyang, during this period, meaning around about 1850, 1860, it is a place where the Daoist monastery of Xuemiaoguan played a central role in protecting the city of Nanyang, the whole city, against, of course, a joint siege by the Nian and also the Taiping rebels, which rose to overthrow the Qing dynasty. And in that pivotal sort of a battle against the dynasty's enemy, Xuemiaoguan and its Xuemiaoguan, the Daoist monastery, and its leading clerics played, of course, a key role, and they literally saved Nanyang. So as a result, it received commendation by the court, by the Qing court, Tongzi Emperor's court, and even conferred a Daozang, a Qing printed Ming Daozang on this monastery. So this is a very sort of what we would now call a central and universal kind of a temple, very important, and with tremendous wealth by this time. It owned as much as, it called under its name, of course, as much as 7,700 mu of farmland as its properties. In addition, it owned many buildings in Nanyang. there is a saying that half of the Nanyang are actually properties either connected with or outright owned by the dynasty, by the monastery. So again, here we show a different sort of a map. This is probably a early Qing or late Ming, early Qing map. Indeed, 1693, an early Qing map. Here outside is the position of the monastery. It's called Yuan. And you remember this is a square-shaped city wall, but it began to be built out into the wall that I showed you early on. And this is relevant to our discussion because we know that in the mid-19th century battle against the Taiping rebels, Xue Miaoguan and its leading cleric by the name of Zhang Yuanxuan, whom we'll encounter later on, played a pivotal role in defending Nanyang. And one of the contributions they made towards the defense of Nanyang is actually building the rampart, what they call it the Half Moon City, which is a defensive rampart city against, of course, the sieging Nian and Taiping rebels. And so I want to show you the map to see the impact, the physical impact of this Daoist monastery in the mid-19th century. So let me move on. This is just an overview of the Shenmiao Temple, and perhaps if I have time, I'll come back to this overview. And so here is actually again a portrait of the monastery. The man that is the center of our story actually is not from Nanyang. He came from actually Shanxi, which is a neighboring province northwest of Nanyang. In his youth, he came from actually what in the sources described as actually a farming but also studying or reading household, Gendu family. So we know that his father and probably grandfather were all actually peasant or small landowners, but however, they had indeed participated in learning. And so in his youth, he actually was one of the stipendiary student, a young son, in the local Weinan County School. So we can know he come from actually maybe a lower sort of a tier of the literati household that owns land and also possess classical learning as well. While he was attending the county school, he developed a reputation for actually his skills in calligraphy and in paintings. And it's not germane to the story I'm telling today, but we know that he had classical Confucian trainings because he originally was indeed pursuing the civil service examination studies, right, as part of that. Then something unfortunate happened in the early 1860s, 62-63, a major Muslim rebellion broke out in northwestern provinces. And during that revolt, initial sort of uprising by the Muslims, the Huiming in China, his parents and many of his relatives perished. They were killed. So he vowed to avenge his parents and a relative, and by joining the Qing army. And in the Qing army, he quickly rose to become initially the captain of actually the bodyguards for a very well-known Dao bannerman general by the name of Do Longe, and who appreciated his bravery and his loyalty during the battle and promoted him to be the captain of his bodyguards. And then very quickly he also was promoted because he saw maybe dozens or scores of action, several dozens of battles, and proving himself to be rather a valiant warrior. He very soon was promoted to become actually a brigadier general in the Qing Green Standard Army. But again, the story we were told that after he's sort of a patron, someone who knows him and promoted him in the army, General Dolong actually was killed because of the wounds that he suffered at Zhouzhi in Shanxi, again in his hometown province. He learned the death of his patron sort of master. He gave up his office. And we know that throughout Chinese history, we have stories told about 士为知己而死. So a warrior really dies for the knowing patron who actually hired them or discovered them or promoted them. And in his case, he gave up his command. And indeed, next we know though whether that's the reason or not. But anyway, he left the Qing army with his, already a rather high position at the brigadier general. He joined, of course, Daoism. He turned to Daoism. At all places in Xinjiang, what is present-day Xinjiang, on Bogota Mountain, at the time, probably sometime in between 1862-64, he traveled there and actually indeed entered the Daoist cloister and became a Daoshi there, and a Fusouguan in Xinjiang. And after that, he trained like a regular Quanzhen Daoist cleric, which meant you travel, you sojourn, you indeed study scriptures, and then also you learn how to do various kind of liturgical rites. You conduct and music as well. And it turned out we later learned that he actually was quite a collector and played zither as well. This is a learned man after all. He had a previous life as a Confucian scholar, as a Confucian student. And we know that he sojourned at many of the famous Taoist mountains and studied Taoist scriptures at, of course, major Taoist universal temples on Mount Laoshan in Shandong, and in Shandong's Shangqingguan in Shenyang, in Taijingguan, in Mengdong in Shenyang as well. Then in early 1870s, I made a mistake here, so in my early 70s, he again traveled and settled at the White Cloud Temple, White Cloud Monastery in Beijing, in the imperial capital city. There he became one of the favorite disciples to Abbot Zhang Yuanxuan. Remember the Taoist who defended Nanyang against the Taipings about 20 years ago, and became one of his favorite disciples. And then after receiving the Quanzhen Daoist precepts, at the 1871 consecration altar held at the Aiyun at the White Cloud Temple, he gradually but steadily rose through the monastic ranks to become actually an assistant prior at the famed White Cloud Monastery by early 1800s already, 1880s. Then probably after, this is again my guessing by reading the lines, and there was a sort of intense sort of a contest for the position of prior to oversee the Aiyun. And it so happened his contender was another very well-known Quanzhen cleric by the name of Gao Yuntong, whom I wrote about as well. Professor Gosat wrote as well. And the two of them probably were competing for the position. And in the end, I think that the old abbot Zhang Yuanxuan intervened and indeed asked Yao Aiyun to go to Nanyang to take over the monastery of dark mystery there, which he had presided for decades. And so this resolved a sort of a what we would now call it the job a job contest, right? And so we know that in around about late 1884, 1885, he arrived at Nanyang. The time he came to Nanyang, of course, concurred, or actually is concurrent with, of course, the height of the self-strengthening movement, reform movement in China. After the defeat of the Taiping, the Qing government, of course, launched various kinds of sort of locally based reform movement, introducing Western technology and early industrial modernization in various parts, especially in Jiangnan. So the context to see his arrival in Nanyang is very important. I think that he's a man who had served in the Qing army, who fought, and he was very well educated, so he knows really what's going on. And at the time, one of the important thing, of course, is the coming of the Western learning. You have scientific text, text of books on mathematics, textbooks in chemistry and physics were being translated by Jiangnan Arsenal's Translation Bureau, that I'm showing the picture here, to China. So the new learning, the Western learning began to indeed be dispersed, especially in the port cities, and then through that to the other parts of China as well. So this is the larger context. Well, as part of the self-strengthening movement, they had begun to dispatch young, selected sort of educated men to study overseas, right? But domestically, of course, we also know that there were discussions, at court and outside the court, in the news media, about promoting, of course, new learning and starting new schools as well. So Xingxue is actually being launched. We know that from 1880s to about 1894, and then afterwards, even though there is that 维新运动, the 百日, 100 days of reform, which kind of politically is a failure. But I think substantively, when you look at what the major reform program were launched, Qing government, especially at the local level, at many of the local level, continued actually the momentum of the reform. So the reform began to actually indeed proliferate as well. As we see that many, however, as they began to start new schools or dispatching students to overseas, the problem they found is actually they were short of money. They were strapped. The finances were strapped because after the war with Taiping, 14 years of long war with Taiping, it already pretty much emptied all the coffers at the local level. As a result of that, big people began to find so-called innovative ways to start new schools, to modernize education. And this is, of course, very well known as temples for school, or 庙产 Xingxue, using temples to start new schools. 庙产 Xingxue, literally. So under such pressures, I'm talking about the state sort of oriented and state-driven reform programs, and then, of course, contrastively, the lack of funding, these pressures pushed many officials and literates began to look beyond the regular revenues of money to look at, of course, such things as old academies. Well, they were old. Each county had these academies. And then they also look at, of course, social organizations, kinship organization that owns ancestral halls and land. They could be also potentially, sources of revenue for the new school. Then the third area they look, of course, is Buddhist and Daoist temples. So this is where, the officials at the court and also the leading literati reformers outside the court all began to call for expropriation or confiscating or seizure of temples in order to start new schools. We know there were proposals put forward. Many of them did not really go into effect, but we know that as time to move on, this discourse about using temples for new school began to mount, became a sort of mounting pressure for many of, indeed, Buddhist and Taoist temples. The loudest voices among this, of course, was that of Kang Youwei and Zhang Zidong. All right, and we can look at, of course, what Kang Youwei said. He said, of course, upon investigation, I have found that Chinese folk tend to lose themselves in indulging in the cult of ghosts and dead deities. So there is an excess of temples under the realm. Using your servant, this is again a memorial to the throne. So he says, using your servant's hometown home province of Guangdong as an example for this discussion, every town for sure have their shrines. All these shrines are public property, what he call it 公产, 庙必公产. Temples must be public properties, which is of course totally wrong. It's not always such in this way. There were universal temples that belonged to either Daoism or Buddhism at large, but not really to everyone, right? And then he says, of course, if we transform these shrines into the schools and convert these public properties as public funds for new school, then every person will know about the new learning, and the schools will be all over the places. So this is Kang Youwei's memorial to the throne to say, let's start new school using this Buddhist and Taoist temples. Why not? Another person who is probably more influential by this time, because he held high positions, much more higher than Kang Youwei. This is Zhang Zidong, who served as Governor General of Huguang, and later on, so his voice is actually quite powerful. He put forth a treatise, a small pamphlet which he wrote, which is called 劝学篇. Anybody who studied modern China have read it, because it's in that schematic plan for modernization, basically, for pushing new learning. He actually spelled out and what to do with these Taoist and Buddhist temples. He actually also tried to use the old county schools, county academies, and all that. But in addition, he was very specific about how to utilize Buddhist and Taoist temples. I underline the translation here to say, probably, he said, of the temples in every county, we take 7 out of 10 and convert them to schools, and keep the 3 of the 10 to house the Buddhist and Taoist clerics. All right, so you have 3 and 7%, right? It's 30 and 70%. This division, 30 to sustain and house the Taoist and Buddhist clerics, and the remaining 70 temples and the temple lands were to become actually, funds and to be converted to schools. Then he says, of their endowment lands, meaning that the school will use 70%, the clerics may live on the 30%, remaining 30%. So Zhang Zidong, 劝学篇 was really devastating. I think that people share that knowledge and share his vision, even though in the end we don't see it as really adopted, as a sort of a Qing state policy. Indeed, Qing state tried to, warn people who confiscate properties, because the monks and Taoists would go to court. It created all kind of problem. But this kind of sort of what shall we say, discourse or narrative become very threatening to Buddhists and Taoists. It created pressure. So I'll skip this Chinese original. So that is the context in which Yao Aiyun arrived in Nanyang and began to perhaps think about how to deal with the reform, the programs of modernity, right? And so we know what added the pressure is, of course, by 1904, the Qing court declared, of course, the abolition of the Kejü Zidu. This is, of course, what Yao Aiyun and many of his generation actually relied on for social mobility. Now that is gone, and what really need to be reintroduced is really new schools. So we don't know, I personally don't know any kind of a spoken statement by Yao Aiyun to say, oh, we need to do this. But what happened is, of course, after that, in the fall of 1905, we began to see a program being put into place by Yao Aiyun, that is to use the monastic resources to start new schools, right? Sometimes, we tend to look at these kind of decisions in a rather cynical or maybe historical way to say, social historical way to say, the motive for a Taoist cleric who presiding a very large Taoist monastery that owns a lot of temple land, 770 7,700 mu, which is really large land holding, to make this kind of decision to start new school, perhaps in a rather cynical way, to say, okay, he did this because there were all these pressures. So he, in a way, caved in, right? He really was trying to avoid being swallowed up by that, okay. That is one argument. But I want to point out that the Taoist monastic activism in local education actually predated 1904, right? This drive towards this new schools and all that. We know that as soon as he arrived in the year of 1885, he started 3 traditional Confucian-styled studios. This is, again, 艺术. We have it in Korea as well, that admitted local schools to prepare them for the civil service examination, right? So that was the track, to educate the poor children of the poor household in northern district of Nanyang. So he started this very early on. So I want to emphasize that his activism in Nanyang actually should be looked at in 2 phases. The first phase is not about modernization. It was just about serving the local community, because, as I will explain, this is a pattern. They were involved in local community, and they were supportive of local community and its residents' aspirations, for their children to be educated. So, the second phase of activism, and this began, of course, after 1904, is the beginning of that is the fall of 1905. In which, of course, he began to systematically sponsor and build and operate 3 local schools. The first one is called the Yuan Miao Monastery, Yuan Miao Guan, 独立两等小学堂. So this is a primary school. We call it primary school, probably as mistranslation. They call it 小学堂. Really, it combines both middle and elementary school, right? Because he called it 高等小学堂 and senior or advanced elementary school, senior school, and then primary school or junior school. Really, two departments. The first one was built in October 1905. The second one, he started barely just, you would say, 3 months out, right? 3 months out. In January 1906, Yao Aiyun built another school, and this one is called the Yuanzhong Advanced and Junior or Senior or Junior Primary Schools, 原中高等初等小学堂 as well. So I will explain then what does that mean, 高等学堂 versus 低小学堂. Then 2 years later, in 1908, Yao Aiyun built a third. This time is just a primary school at a place called Bo-Wang-Zhen. Those who study Sanguo period knows this is a place a major battle took place between Liu Bei and Cao Cao. And anyway, so here I break down each of the school and its makeup. So when we speak about the senior school, it admits students from really 12 to 17. That's almost like from middle school to high school, right? That's pretty much. And then you have the junior section of this school that admits children from 7 to 12. That's like elementary school or primary school for that matter. And it was built initially, this first school was actually housed in the east wing of the monastery in Nanyang, in northwest of outside the city. And so Yao Aiyun even hired, personally interviewed and hired actually a local Nanyang stipendiary student by the name of Wang Xianbing, very well known and highly respected local scholar, to serve as the principal. And it made sure that the school operated on an annual budget of 600 to 700 taels of silver to buy various instructional materials and all that. The school conforms to the Qing administration's, shall we say, standard for all new schools in China in terms of its curriculum. So the curriculum is very standard. You can here look at, of course, 修身, 教经, 国文, 算术, 历史, 地理, 格致, and 图画, and 体操. So they were very standard and then were actually conform 100%. This is not a religious school. It's just a regular new school that combines traditional as well as Western learning, scientific learning. It enrolled a total of 117 students, the junior section 75, the senior section 45, and 42, and hired a teaching faculty, and also the management staff composed of about 7 people, including people. So it's a private, we now call it a private school, right? So its operating budget is relatively smaller in comparison to the state-funded new schools in Nanyang. We'll get to that a little bit later. So this is a second school that was started in actually only 3 months after. Now apparently within a very short space of 3 months, clearly, there is a market for it. So he expanded on this activist sort of a program in new education by starting another second school. And this one is also 2 sections, the junior section and then the senior section. And we don't need to go into too much detail, but I'm here showing you this one was actually, bought because they expanded operation. It bought actually a household, a property of a estate of the Ye household, a Ye lineage. And this is also in northern quarter of Nanyang. And this time the investment was much larger because it had to start build new schools and all that, new buildings. The total investment was actually, I think, as much as 11,770 taels of silver, right? And again, we have very clear sort of description of the curriculum for both sections, junior and senior. It enrolled a total of 96 students, and indeed, of course, based on the 1908 government survey that actually, was based on the inspection report of the school. It found the 2 sections of the Yuanzhong school are both qualified. Its management is strict. Its physical and physical education courses particularly well taught and tops all other schools in Nanyang. So this school received high praises from the Qing government officials that year. Here's the third one, and again, you can see that this is again very standard curriculum, and this is the third school. All right. In comparison, and roughly between this period, we're talking about 1904, not to 1920, but to 1910. There were about 9 major new schools built in the city of Nanyang. Out of this, initially I say 2, but we now have 3 out of that. In other words, 1/3 of all the new schools started in Nanyang were paid for and were actually indeed operated by Yao Aiyun and his monastery. So this is something rather significant when we think about it. When we think about the history of Daoism in a local society, the impact, I think, is quite significant. And I don't know if that's clear or not, but anyway, I marked these areas. This is actually the first one, and then the second one, and then the other one was not shown because it's on the sort of remote suburb of Nanyang, in one of the sort of township outside Nanyang. Well, Yao Aiyun's activism did not go unnoticed by both local officials as well as the provincial governor of Henan. And they organized together, they got together, and they petitioned the Board of Rights, and also then they petitioned the throne, the emperor himself, to say that this Taoist really made a huge contribution, and we should reward him and we should actually commend him. So, not surprisingly, in 1906, I think in the summer, the court issued a placard, a board inscribed with such word as 全真广学. 全真 is a abbreviation of Quanzhen Daoism, which is, of course, Yao Aiyun's own sort of religious sect. So this is actually probably the highest commendation one Taoist monastery could receive. We know another temple in Guangzhou received a similar commendation, but it was later, right? So, all right. I don't want to say this is a singular case. This is probably my later argument, because if you look at Guangzhou, you look at Wuchang, Wuhan, you look at Tianjin, you look at Shenyang, and that Liao Aiyun visited. This is just, anecdotally. My generation of Chinese growing up in these cities would know that one of the local primary school or middle school is actually named after a monastery, a Taoist monastery, not to mention also many other Buddhist monasteries. These are the traces of the early monastic activism, not only by Taoism, maybe by Buddhism as well, in local education. I just want to emphasize that too. Yet in all standard Chinese sort of a history of modern education, there was no mention of the contribution from these indigenized religious traditions, Buddhism and Taoism. All right. Now, so what happened to our abbot, Abbot Yao? When 1911, when the 1911 revolution uprising against the Qing broke out, of course, there was a column of volunteers from Nanyang who were resident in Wuhan. They were armed. They were actually indeed armed, They began to march towards Nanyang, and they took Nanyang, the city, actually in the early 1912. When that happened, the abbot actually went into hiding, all right? And when the Republican regime, of course, heard his reputation, they began to send an emissary, a go-between, to tell the abbot not to worry, to come out of hiding. And when Yao believed their word and came out into the city, he was immediately arrested and then, of course, summarily tried, and with these charges. These charges were brought against him. One alleged crime is that he was in collusion with the Qing government officials. He also indeed, bullied local residents or population. And then the third crime was he have squandered away the Taoist monastic properties and wealth. And by that they mean probably the schools that he built and so on. But anyway, that's not the case. So after the summary trial, the Republican regime in Nanyang under General Ma Yunqing actually sentenced Yao to death by execution. Allegedly, at his execution, Yao screamed, "Oh my heavenly Lord, I am wronged. I am wronged." Soon after, half of Xuemiaoguan, so 7,700 mu of temple lands, were confiscated by the Nanyang Republican military government as the sort of public funds. In October 1914, however, the Republican National Military Tribunal found General Ma, the man who executed Yao Aiyun, to be guilty of embezzlement and indeed blackmail and so on. There was a host of crime. It turned out that General Ma was in the habit of blackmailing and framing people with false charges in order to extract money from them. All right. Okay. The story I want to tell, maybe I will end soon, because it's not surprising. This general who executed Yao Aiyun himself died. And so let me conclude. I think that Abbot Yao Aiyun's death is worth our reflections regarding Daoist relationship with China's modernity. We should at least ask the following question. Why a Daoist abbot who devoted his life to starting new and modern schools seemed not acceptable to the modernizing Republican regime in Nanyang? Is Abbot Yao's death simply an isolated tragedy brought on by a venal and corrupt Republican general, or is his tragedy actually reflective of a much more widespread and more deeply rooted prejudice against Daoism among the Republican political and cultural elites? To many of them, did Daoism and Daoists still represented China's cultural and social backwardness and superstitions of all, and therefore it deserved to be suppressed? So these questions at least we should ask. I, however, would argue that the fact that Abbot Yao's sustained activism in modern education in Nanyang defies our commonly held stereotypical view about Daoism and its relationship with modernity. Indeed, the case of Yao's activism shows that Daoism was far from being either a hapless victim nor a desperate opponent to the processes of China's modernity. Instead, Daoism could and did actively collaborated with the modernizing Qing state in bringing about educational reforms in local society in Nanyang. Since such collaboration was also part of Nanyang Daoist monastery's own tradition, it also conformed to the monastery's long-established pattern of investing in and serving local community in Nanyang. So, how should we understand the goals and motives of the Daoist and his monastery's activism in new education in Qing Nanyang? We must not simply see such Daoist activism as optimistic or cynical adaptive strategies to cope with the Qing state, rather menacing threat of temple seizures. Even though we cannot completely rule out such possible motives at the national level, because in other places, yes, Buddhist monks and Taoist clerics did adopt, a very cynical strategy. So if you want to confiscate my temple, I start a school to say, okay, you can't do that now. That's one strategy. But the case in Nanyang, I want to argue, is somewhat different from that. So I plead and then I argue we should not look at Yao Aiyun's activism as being rather cynical adaptation to the state policy or the threat of temple seizures. One, I argue, Abbot Yao had already started 3 free traditional schools in the northern district of Nanyang in 1885 to serve the educational needs of the poor children in Nanyang, nearly a decade before the Qing state's educational reform that formally launched in the year of 1904. Second, Abbot Yao and his monastery had a long history of investing in and serving the local community in Nanyang, as I have demonstrated in several other studies. One had to do with early Qing reconstruction. This is between 1650 to about 1670. In that 20 years or so, I wrote an article called "The General Zhang Buries the Bone," which talks about how Xuanmiao Monastery and its clerics participated in the early Qing reconstruction of Nanyang, in the restoration of local economy and repopulation of Nanyang by collecting the bones, right, and rebury them. Because after the late Ming wars around and inside Nanyang, Li Zicheng, for instance, the rebel Li Zicheng, breached the Nanyang city in 1575 or so. And there were many deaths. There were bones all over the place, right? And so that created a sort of a imagery or visual scene of a unpacified world. So symbolically, it is politically a liability to the new conquest dynasty of Qing court, right? And we know as early as the Xia, if you believe the early Shangshu and so on, it points to the burial of the shallowly sort of exposed bodies and bones. In other words, bone burial, human skeletal bone burial, had already early on been touted as a Confucian governance, is what we call it a benevolent governance, 仁政, that dated back to the Xia dynasty, if dynasty existed, of course. But again, in Confucian narrative, this is always the thing. So I think that the Taoists participated early on by, this type of sort of a bone collection on behalf of or at the behest of the local Nanyang Qing government. So there was that early collaboration that I wrote about. The second case arose, of course, as I made mention to early on, in the mid-19th century, again, rather drastic and dramatic, when Taiping rebels and Nian rebels began to encircle and lay siege to Nanyang. And of course, it was the Taoist, Abbot Yao's own teacher, mentor, Zhang Yuanxuan, stepped forward and made huge donation in building that moon-shaped northern rampart, and of course led the Taoists, participated in the defense of the city wall, and in also manufacturing even firearms and as well. And the article that I wrote is about in defense of state and polity, city and polity in that article. Then of course between the late Ming to early Republican era, we know that the monastery routinely invested its annual surplus grains in many of the local grain stores in Nanyang. These grains or money deposit were withdrawn in times of famine, in times of drought, to feed the poor and starving, but deposited in these grains in these grain shops to sustain local market in peacetime. So you can see that the Taoists operated a certain moral economy over time. And this, of course, is not without, indeed, self-serving interests or goals. Of course, they built up a reputation. Locals really respected them. When I did my field work in the 2000s and also, and there were still elderly, surviving elder people who lovingly recalled story about how the monastery in the early spring, when there's no food, actually operated various kind of gruel stations and offered clothing to the locals as well. So those are anecdotal, of course. So let me just conclude my lecture here, and I would be happy to answer any questions after a brief, maybe a break. So thank you.
Okay, we will open the Q&A session. And before that, I would like to introduce our distinguished guest here. Thank you for joining us, Professor Quanzhen from Department of History at SNU. And we have Professor Daniel Burton-Rose from Wenzhou Kean University, and Professor Kim Yoon-kyung from Incheon National University. Actually, she is an associate dean of College of Education now. Thank you for joining us. And please feel free to ask questions from floor or online. First, please introduce yourself. Yeah.
What a delicate ideological dance it is. I mean, it's kind of like exploring Tsarist Russia through Leo Tolstoy. I mean, you're saying this is a guy who embodies the way the system was supposed to work, meaning we have local elites who interface with the sitting powers, and those local elites are essentially benevolent. So we know he's a huge landlorder. landlord, but you talk about ways that he tries to improve agriculture, and he's trying to bring in innovations, and he's responding to the pressures the way that people should respond to the pressures from below in education, and he's filling a market niche. We can tell that people were responding to his innovations because he's continuing to expand them. So obviously people were responding. So I think that's all valid. But the world is falling apart around him, and he's essentially wronged by being murdered. So I'm just trying to think about the different sociological niches that he's filling in these different time periods. So this is kind of long-winded because I'm thinking through these different periods. But when you first did the Quanzhen conference at UC Berkeley, I think over a decade ago now, one of the areas I was hoping would be filled in about Quanzhen historiography was how many of these guys were military. And so they're really being used by the state with military background to secure new areas for Qing control. For example, in Yunnan, even in the Ming period. And so he is one of those people. So in your conclusions and in your introduction, I'm a little worried that you're picking and choosing identities for him as you're framing these questions. And I think people in his own day had valid reasons to see him under different identities, right? So in the way you were framing the final one, you have it as Republican versus a Taoist, right? But this is also somebody who has fought for the Qing and has worked closely with all these Qing rulers. And so certainly one of the problems for local society is to do anything in these times of turmoil means you have a target on your back, right? And so the most dignified way you could frame this guy is he knew the risks, and for the people, fulfilling his Taoist vows, fulfilling his role as a local elite, he takes the risk. And so in terms of Taoist historiography, him going out screaming is actually very undignified, right? So this all isn't really a question, but I do think you have to be consistent throughout this project in saying there's a class identity, local elite, which includes owning lands, potentially there is this kind of pool of discontent underneath, which may not be directly his responsibility, but he plays a role in alleviating. There's dynastic affiliation, and of course we're entering in the first period where we're not just, for a new dynasty, we're anti-dynastic as such. And then there's Taoist. And so I think in asking these questions, you have to have kind of all three rubrics balanced at once.
Okay. May I respond? Or okay, that's actually a good question, very good one. And this, by the way, is also based on the most recent article that I submitted to Journal of Chinese Religion. And they kind of accepted, but they raised some questions that actually I'm also working my way through it as well. I think these are very important questions. I see him primarily as a Taoist. And I think Taoists are part of the local elite, all right? I don't see any conflict in that, all right? That's one thing. The other thing that you brought up is, of course, the fact that how I characterize him, right? He was actually an ex-Qing army officer and ranking officer, at that. And indeed, of course, this, however, does not necessarily, shall we say, compromise him in any way. I mean, in his role as a Taoist abbot and Taoist prior and abbot, and it worked fairly well. It worked fairly well with his political connections. And actually, in my article, I didn't mention the other Taoist turned Qing army official, Xie Baosen. The two of them actually were very good friends. And Xie Baosen was here, by the way. In Seoul. He came to Seoul during the Yuan Shikai. During even before that, there was a early intervention during the Jiawu, Sino, the first Jiawu. He came to Korea. And however, he felt enraged that there was so much corruption within the Qing army, so he quit. And then, after he went back, and they, again, brought him back as well. So in terms of Quanzhen Daoism and the military, the Qing military, there is that. Both Van Son and I have been exploring this. What are the meanings? We know that many of them quit, or many of them join for various kind of reasons. I know more about Yao Aiyun than I do Shi Baosheng, whom I'm also actually working on right now, as to what it means. I mean, the former military officer who then were called up and rejoined the Qing army and now serving as actually a commander of all the Qing forces in Nanyang, while Yao Aiyun is the abbot of the Daoist temple here. Well, for the new regime, and clearly they would see this as corrupt and collusion and all that. They don't look at the new school, right? Or they pretend not to look at it. So that itself is a complex legacy for the Republican revolutionary or the Republican elite to say, indeed, we know that many Republican elite are not like what I described them to be, anti-Daoism or whatever. They were very close and chummy, very close with Daoists as well. But in this particular case, I didn't bring this complicating factor. General Ma Yunqing might be a Muslim, all right? But I don't have evidences yet, so I can't make another argument. This is about inter-religious kind of a rivalry or ethnic religio conflict. In other words, the reason he was ultimately put to death is because, he participated in that suppression of the earlier suppression of the Hui uprising. That could be another twist in its story, telling the first narrative of the story. Who knows what I will find? Because Ma Yunqing's identity, in all his biography, did not make his not ethnic, but religious background of being a Muslim that prominent at all. So I don't feel that I have enough evidence to say it's also revenge killing, but under the politics of Republican politics, right, which is to uproot the Qing and all that. So I know that there is a bit of a complexity here. I mean, a complicated situation here that I need to sort out more carefully. Maybe you could re-narrate the import of your question regarding the military and Daoism a bit more.
It's more of something. Sorry, it's less of a question and more of something that I'm hoping will get filled out in Quanzhen historiography. But basically, what I'm saying is, when you're engaged in the world, there's no kind of innocent position, and often the way that we try to think of religion is outside the world, right? And he's doing things in the world, and part of what he's doing with a military background is, as you said, being on call, and I think, because so much of the rhetoric of monastics in general is, we're peace-loving people, we're harmonious, they very much allied the way in which they are engaged in the world. To be a landowner means you need to be able to defend it. So for example, in Longhushan, in the Yuan, the Daoists, the Zhang Celestial Master Organization, they have their own militia. They're big landlords. Why wouldn't they have their own militia? The history of the Shaolin Si, or the kind of famous example of Buddhist martial arts. They're working with Tang armies very early on. In the case of the Imjin War, today you were at the Tongmyo, you saw kind of how Guandi is imposed on the Chosun people as a condition of Ming military aid, but also in that conflict, the Weibiong, is that right? The righteous Buddhist armies become a big part of that conflict. So in some ways, I'm saying maybe we need to kind of foreground these military legacies that, this Weberian definition of the state, where the state is a legitimate monopoly on violence, and that does make you vulnerable. In a way, I'm saying maybe he doesn't have anything to complain about by being killed. Okay, now I think I'm more clear on what you were driving at now. I think that in this telling today, and maybe in the article overall that I wrote for this journal for Chinese studies, I may have presented him as a somewhat of a righteous sort of a Taoist, right? Without really telling the complicated life that he has led up to the point, right, when he was killed. And
Indeed, he was very much involved in that world. Initially in the Qing army, campaign against the Muslim uprising, and later on, of course, as a big leader of a big land-owning monastery in Nanyang, he had a lot of power and influence, and he may tread indeed, as the crime alleged, over the local people, right? It could be that, and so I thank you for that. I mean, in other words, I don't want to present a sort of a wholly perfect kind of a Taoist. Really, the Taoist that's very much deeply involved in the world, and because of that, right? And again, my point about the cry for being round is that our historian, my colleagues, maybe 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, would not, even acknowledge the Taoist contribution in this area or their engagement with modernity as he has done, and therefore it was that. It was a rhetorical kind of way to sharpen the kind of ignorance that I say many of my fellow historians of modern Chinese education history or modern Chinese history period about the important role religion played in that as well. So thank you for that. I think I got the point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wonder, other than Nanyang, did any Taoist monastery attempt to build new schools and a new educational movement? Is the first one, and were any Taoist abbots or adepts involved in education after modernization?
Mm-hmm.
And second one is about the contents of the Abbot Yao.
Aiyun.
Yeah, Aiyun's try to make a new curriculum. There was I saw the curriculum as cultivation and physical education. So is there any continuity with the Taoist cultivation culture? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kim. Those were excellent questions, actually. The second question I'll answer first. I don't know enough about what was taught in Shousen, in self-cultivation. I thought maybe it's a very traditionally oriented Confucian classics about social and moral philosophy, but I don't really know enough to say more about but this is not by any means a Taoist specific curriculum. This curriculum conformed to the Board of Learning, 学部, at the time issued in order to guide the formation or the construction of new schools throughout the empire. It's not, I mean, it's ultimately, it's somewhat secular, but that's really from the perspective of the Qing state, right? It still wants these Confucian virtues and Confucian values to be inculcated in the students, therefore the self-cultivation. But it's not the Taoist kind of cultivation for sure. And did the Taoists ever try to remodel, reformulate, like the Catholic, the seminaries the Catholic have and all that? I have no evidences of that yet. And I know that the Buddhist schools in Nanyang prior to the new education reform did indeed both gave what they called the qimeng, as you talk about the other, and also I think the other professor from in Daegu when we were talking, they gave both what they called the qimeng education, in other words, a beginning education to these young children, but at the same time though, they also began to teach some Buddhist precepts as well. But that was only with the Buddhist. I don't see it in the early three, pre-1905, early three schools that he started in Nanyang, Abbot Yao started in Nanyang. What do they teach in there? I have no evidences of what they teach in there. I can only imagine it's probably the very standard sort of civil service preparation at the first stage, in other words, right? So that all. The first question actually is an important one because I don't want Nanyang to be the single isolated case. And so I gave a few examples there. In the city where I grew up, it's called Wuhan. Wuhan is made of three parts, three towns. In the south, on the south is Wuchang, and in Wuchang there was a very famous Taoist temple. It's called Changchun Guan. It's Qiu Changchun Changchun Guan, and I personally know, and I have read memoirs of my generation or older who talk about their going to what they call it the Changchun Guan Xiaoxue. Literally translated in English, it meant the Eternal Spring Monastery Primary School. All right. So these are traces, I said early on. So far, I have a case in Wuhan. I also have a case in Tianjin. Tianjin, there is a Senghai Gong. It's really probably Mazu, but it's managed by Taoist clerics. They have also a Senghai Gong Xiaoxue. So in other words, literally, the Saint of the Sea Shrine Primary School. In Shenyang, in Mengdong, in Shenyang, which is closer to here, there was a supreme clarity palace managed by Quanzhen Daoism, which Yao Aiyun visited when he first became a Taoist. They also, in the 1890s, started a school. It's called Taiqing Guan Xiaoxue. So that meant Supreme Clarity Palace small elementary school or primary school. So we have these evidences. Then, of course, in Guangzhou, we have a San Yuan Gong who was involved in the promotion of school and was also commendated by the Qing court as well. So if we dig a little bit deeper, if we are all, right now, I have a very solid case in Nanyang. I think we can build a case in Wuhan, in Taichung Gong, in Shenzhen, in Xi'an as well. I forgot to mention Xi'an. So the one can actually begin to see that I cannot vouch for all the Taoists in these places acted from a long pattern of local investment and local service, but at least in Nanyang we see that, right? So I think that if we unpack the history of Taoist monastic involvement in local society over a long period of time, these supposedly very new things suddenly pop up would not appear to be sudden or unexpected, because they had been in the past doing the same thing in different forms for local society, for the local residences in one way or the other. So at least an argument can be made to say this is not just a temporary or what we would call it, even a cynical or optimistic adaptation to the Qing state-directed new education reform, right? It's not, in order to avoid being confiscated, in order to avoid for their temples to be confiscated, they start a new school. To say, the government will say, oh, you already done it, we don't touch you. But rather, if you look at the long history in Nanyang, I think I can make an argument to say it makes more sense to view it in long-term involvement based on that. So, yeah.
So I have a question about kind of yet another form of contestation and memorialization, kind of keeping these legacies alive, moving towards the present. This may have been maybe your slide number 9. It's page 5 in the handout, and so you're listing Quanzhen, but you're also showing that this abbot was the head of the Shifang Tonglin, these kind of universal shrines. Yes, that one. One more forward. Yeah, this stop. We're back. Yes. So yellow in the upper right. You're basically listing all these other kind of pie or branches or potential sectarian identities of people who have a monastic obligation to travel around and visit different monasteries. And so he's kind of playing a host there. But I'm wondering if even within Taoism, he is something other than Quanzhen. So for this work on Shi Daoyuan that Professor Gosar and I are doing, Tao Jin has shown how this early Qing figure, who is basically stitching together the post conquest environment in the way that the General Zhang that you mentioned was doing for this site in Nanyang. He's the figure from Suzhou is doing this everywhere from Beijing down to Guangzhou, kind of ritual reintegration of the realm. But he's also bringing together Quanzhen and Zhengyi at the same time in a way that people like Minnie De can't handle later on. But Tao Jin has shown how there's this section called Qi Shi, which kind of invoking the teachers. That's a standard form of Taoist liturgy, in which Shi Daoyuan from the early Qing is still being remembered every time a ritual is performed at the Chenghong Miao in Shanghai, in these other sites in Suzhou, including Suzhou's Shuanmiao Guan. So I'm just curious if this figure is also living within Taoism and contested within Taoist lineages.
Yao Aiyun per se, Abbot Yao Aiyun per se, is unquestionably a Quanzhen Daoist. However, he belongs to two sub-lineages, right? He started his Taoist career actually as a Huashan Pai. So he belongs to the order or sect of Huashan, Mount Huashan, and which again traces allegedly earlier sort of Qing and Yuan dynastic sort of lineages as well. But in the Quanzhen tradition, it is always the other sect. This is the sect of the Dragon Gate, the Longmen Pai. They were dominated or monopolized the Taoist consecration rite. So only they could hold what amounts to the equivalent to Buddhist Soujie, another consecration altars where a Buddhist may be indeed consecrated as a full sort of a Buddhist and all that. Only the Longmen sect or the Longmen order of Quanzhen could do that. So as a result, because he was elevated, he received the Longmen. When he became a full Taoist at Aiyun in 1871 under Zhang Yuanxuan, he was passed precepts that centered around Longmen sect. So he took on a Longmen identity as well within Quanzhen, larger Quanzhen lineage. But that's probably too technical for all of us here, maybe, even for me. But his Quanzhen identity was never questioned. Quanzhen Daoist never questioned. He wasn't really, probably it's not a good comparison to Sidao Zhen in Suzhou, who actually openly, claimed both identity, Zhengyi as well as Quanzhen.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. Yeah, so I have a curiosities. A little bit. So I'd like to two questions. So first one, page 12, I'm very interested this curriculum of junior primary school. Yeah. So I saw probably it's a first class self-cultivation in case of a junior primary school. Yeah, so I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm curious that is there connected characteristics between Taoist cosmology and ontology and Yao's modern educational activities? So it is a first question. Yeah, that's why self-cultivation is based on the Taoist cosmology and ontology. Yeah, it is a first one. Second one, so I'd like to ask you, so to be honest, I'm digging some reading materials, likely spirit writing scriptures related to Musangdan in Joseon in 19th century. At that time, So Korean spirit writing activities also tried to change many things like culture and politics and so forth. So is there in Quanzhen Daoist, is there spirit writing activities in their communities? So involved Aiyun.
Yeah.
If there is spirit writing activities in their communities, so is there connecting point between spirit writing activities and Yao's modern educational activities? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim, for your question. And I think the second one is really of interest to me as well. I'll start with the second one because I think that the Wuxiang Tan that you study and Professor Kim study as well is a very interesting sort of a social group and setting for understanding the practice, right? So far, I personally have not encountered a similar sort of a Taoist group involved in the spirit writing that we see in Korea or in other parts of China and separately. But it doesn't mean that there were no Quanzhen Daoist or Quanzhen Dao monastery and all that involved in spirit writing, because I have run into sources in which they talk about divination. Now, divination, it's not outright spirit writing, but it is something that already departed from their earlier sort of very staunch criticism of spirit writing, right? Early Quanzhen actually dismissed a look at this, but however, they do have the descent of the 7 early patriarchs. They have those writing in poems. You do run into even Jingyuan era poems in which they talk about the descent of the masters as well. So within the Quanzhen Daoist tradition, whether there is spirit writing or not, I think I don't really know enough to answer that question. But we do have descriptions or poetries recounting the appearance of these masters, orally telling them something or something like that nature. So that kind of a encounter were recorded. In the time that I study in Nanyang, or of the Buddhism of the Quanzhen Daoists that I study, I personally have not found any. Now, in the other book that Professor Kim showed that I studied, the Taoist reformers in Shanghai, they are reformers, but they were involved in spirit writing. Chen Yining and his wife and the whole group of self-cultivation practitioners, they were involved in spirit writing. And they have actually very active involvement in that. They say experiment, but it was also not reserved or exclusively among themselves. The spirit writing during the early Republican period is widespread in the government, among officials as well. So early 20th century, this was very widespread in China. So that's the social context. The first questions about, if I understand correctly, is about did any of the Taoist ontology or cosmology filtered into the schools that the Taoists sponsored and operated? Is that the answer question, or I maybe I'm not understanding your first question?
Is there connecting characteristics between the Taoist cosmology and ontology and Yao's modern educational movements?
Yeah. Oh, I see. I understand it from the perspective of a Quanzhen Daoist long-term engagement with local society. Whether it amounted to the level of cosmology or ontology, I don't have any evidences of that. But my understanding is that Yao Aiyun, what Yao Aiyun did, he seldom explicitly, we didn't hear him in the sources, but we can only see what he did. And what he did, for instance, we're talking about agricultural reform, teaching the local how to farm, and all these have a longer tradition in Quanzhen Daoism that dates back to the Qing and Yuan period. In other words, 12 to about maybe 14th century, so on. So I can only see that, the overlapping or the mirroring of that earlier sort of tradition of serving local community, of getting involved in providing services, and indeed embedding oneself in local community. And agriculture is very much part of it. And this may be different because we know during the early Quanzhen, they were engaged in a self-sufficient monastic economy. So they plant their own rice, wheat, or depending on where they are, and then they live on it. But here we clearly have a landlord, right? We have a monastic landlord. The monastery got fabulously rich, and I don't know whether the Daoists were still engaged in agriculture. From what I study at other monasteries, yes, they were still engaged in cultivation. And but at Aiyun also, they have Daoists rotating to work on the farms. So in that sense, it's not about cosmology, but it's about a certain kind of a social commitment or social philosophy that the Quanzhen Daoists have in terms of dealing with local society.
I have two questions as well. First, I wonder if there's any information available about the students that attended Yao's schools and their future paths after graduation. And I also wonder if there are any remaining textbooks from any of his schools, because I thought that if we know about this, we could better understand the goals and characteristics of Yao's education and also his influence within the local communities.
Thank you for your wonderful question as well. The students' account of their experience at this local school, I don't find that any of that in Nanyang yet. But I did find that in Tianjin, the Haisheng Gong that I find, they write about how they got their, they were first of the family to attend a school, and they were grateful, and later on some of them became teachers, some of them became, in other words, it's a very kind of a secularizing process of all the other modern schools afforded to Chinese who attend them. They get socially elevated as a result. They become government clerks, they become professionals in that way. And yes, we have a very clear collective memory of attending what was like, and they even wrote about that master, not of the Daoists, but the Daoist appointed headmaster or the principal of the school and the teachers and all that. And I want to emphasize maybe this is a way to answer the question about the textbooks as well. These schools are not a Catholic school, okay? We know what a Catholic school is, right? It does regular modern education. They also teach you catechism, right? They teach you principles of Catholicism and all that. So it's religious and secular combined together, right? That's a model of Catholicism. In China, I mentioned an early Buddhist school that has a little flavor of that. But I don't find that with Daoism at all. This is an answer to the question that Professor Kim asked as well. In other words, I can see the presence of Daoist ontology or Daoist cosmology reflected in the curriculum. And the textbook, yes, we do have them, but I don't find the textbook in Nanyang per se. But the Nanyang school were found by the Provincial Bureau of New Learning to be in accordance with the stipulations by the National Board of Learning. So that meant they use a standard textbook. In other words, it is a regular, secular, modern, and school that combined with some old Confucian teaching at the same time. So the textbook, I expect them to be uniform and standard in that province or even nationally. So, but I had to look more to say specifically in Nanyang what kind of textbook they use. There were options, right? We know that some were influenced more by Japan, the Meiji Japan. Some were more influenced by the English or the American system as well. So yeah, but thank you for that question. It's very helpful as well. So.
Thank you, Professor
Oh,
Liu.
okay.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture today, and thank you for all thoughtful and helpful question and answers. I want to conclude today's event here. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.